Hello and welcome to a new run of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. I've done more than 100 shows now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Today, I'm delighted to be chatting to British artist Ptolemy Mann. Ptolemy came to widespread attention with her woven textile pieces, often stretched across a frame and notable for her extraordinary use of colour. More recently, her practice shifted and she turned to painting on paper with fascinating and inevitably colourful results. Her latest pieces combine the two as she paints on her hand-woven artworks. She's hard to avoid at the moment. As I speak, she has a show of her paintings at the Union Club in London's Soho. There'll be a solo exhibition at Cromwell Place in May during London Craft Week, and her first monograph is published by Hurtwood that same month. Ptolemy, thank you very much for doing this. How the devil are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good. Well, it's lovely to see you. It's been a while.
It has.
We're talking over Zoom. From what I can see, you have the most colourful studio that we've spoken to anybody in. But where are you working from at the moment? And what does it look like?
So I am currently working in Hastings, right by the sea on the southeast coast of the UK. And I am in a studio that is currently flanked by very large hand-dyed and woven artworks in preparation for my solo show that's coming up. And I'm really enjoying being by the sea, actually. It's a new experience for me and it's working really well so far.
Good, because you were, I think I'm right in saying, in Borough in London, right?
I was. So for many years, I had the most fabulous studio on Clink Street. And I moved in 1998 when the Tate Modern had not even opened. And at the time, everyone was asking me, where is Borough? Nobody even knew where Borough was. And it was such an exciting place to be. And I ended up being there. I thought I'd only be there for a few months. And I ended up being there for 14 years. So it was a big change when I left there.
Why did you decide to leave?
I think like many artists and designers, I have a gigantic loom. And I was lucky in a way. I mean, it was miraculous to stay in one place for so many years. I think that's quite unusual. I think over that period of, 14, 15 years, I think the rent quadrupled probably over that period of time. And you just get to a point where you realize, this is just crazy. But it was great. For that period of time in my life, it was really fantastic. So I lived and worked in London for a good 20 years. And then I relocated to Sussex.
So why Hastings?
That's a good question. I guess it's cheaper and there are a lot of artists here. I keep hearing this phrase, Hackney on Sea. It's where a lot of artists that can't afford to live in Hackney any longer are moving down to Hastings. I like it. It's very vibrant and very creative and incredibly mixed. And I think overall it's been a really good move for me. I mean, I've been in Sussex now for 12 years or something, so it's been a while. But I still feel very attached to London, that's for sure.
And you have a lot going on right now. I mean, I was at your show of paintings at the Union Club in London, Soho, yesterday. In fact, you've got a bunch of other shows coming up later in the year, and you have a new monograph that's about to be published in May by Hurtwood, which traces your work from your woven pieces through to your more recent painting and subsequently painting on your woven work. So why now? Why was this the right time for a book?
I think when you've been making work really strongly and really consistently for such a long time. I mean, I graduated in 1997 and the day after I graduated, I set up my studio and I've worked nonstop since then. I mean, it has been really, I think anyone who's really dedicated to what they do, you've just got to really put the hours in. And I think I've always wanted to do a book, always knew that there was a book in me. And I think there's another book definitely in me as well. And I think also it's to do with, I turned 50 last year. And I think there's this sort of moment in your career where you sort of just feel like you're ready for the next phase. And it also has coincided with this sort of incredibly exciting and unexpected transition. When you train as a weaver, like I did, ECAT weaving is just phenomenally specific. It's a very, very, very niche thing.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a bit, I suspect.
Okay. So I think it's just the right time. It's a really, really exciting moment, but it's also the timing is right. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I started doing what I'm doing, color was not cool. Weaving was certainly not cool. And I just hung in there, for years. And I think it's been really interesting just to see how gradually the climate is changing. The creative climate is really changing. And you will know better than anyone, especially in the craft world. And I think this merging of art and craft, I think is really interesting right now. And that didn't exist when I graduated. You really were one or the other, very much so. And of course, I defy that even further by doing the design as well. So in a way, I hit all those points, the design, the art, and the craft. But I think it's a really exciting moment. So the book, it's been brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
So did you feel you were rubbing up against the fashion of the time when you graduated?
Very much so.
And was that conscious?
I'm a very intuitive and instinctual kind of person. And I think I just fell in love with colour and Bauhaus and making and craftsmanship. And it just so happened that when I was at art school, it was the early 90s. Everyone was interested in John Pawson and minimalism and no colour. You had to be weaving monofilament and wire and metal. And no one was interested in sort of the craftsmanship of something. It was all about technology, especially at St. Martin's at that time. No one really cared about the Bauhaus. I think we don't realise at the moment, the Bauhaus was not cool for a while. It really fell out of fashion, which seems sort of hard to imagine right now. But I think, 30 years ago, nobody really wanted to know about colour. And I felt very aware that, people would sort of say, oh, your work, you're so colourful. And it wasn't a compliment. It was like a sort of slightly an insult,
Well, did you take that as an insult in that case?
I took it in good humor, but that idea of like, oh, she's so colourful and oh, colour's sort of fun and decorative and cute. And it used to really irritate me sometimes because for me, colour is a really powerful tool and a really extraordinary one and one that is really kind of underrated. And anyone who works in art and design or craft or anything, has to know about colour, even if they choose to reject it. You've still got to take it on board. So I was really shocked, actually. But in the end, in a way, I was so naive. I just thought, well, I'm really into it. So I'm gonna make it my thing. And the more I did it, the more my work progressed through my 20s. It just became really obvious that color was my thing. It was just synonymous with everything I did, whether I liked it or not. And it turned out that I had a very intuitive and free and kind of fearless approach to color. Probably at a time when I think people were quite nervous about colour and quite tentative about using it.
Can we start by talking about your weaving, which is how you established yourself? I'm keen to know why textiles in the first instance, because I think I'm right in saying that you always wanted to be a painter.
That's absolutely right. And there's a lovely essay in the book, actually, that kind of talks about this a bit more. I'm quite pragmatic, and I really was clear right from the beginning that I had to make a living from whatever I did, whatever artistic pursuit it was. I feel really strongly about this, and I don't think people talk about it enough. I think to decide that you are going to support yourself financially through your artistic endeavor is a big decision. And I always say to students and younger people that, it's great to make that decision, I think. So I always knew it had to work, it had to function, and it had to bring some income in. So textiles appealed to me. I mean, I did want to be a painter. And when I was on foundation course at Maidstone, actually, where Tracy Emin went and people like that, I was told very bluntly, you're a terrible painter, but you're a girl and you're good with color. Do textiles. And, when you're 18, I mean, I was devastated. I was just like, oh.
I've heard this story before, and obviously it's in the book. It strikes me as interesting, Ptolemy, because we've known each other a while, and I've always thought of you as this kind of very strong, forthright individual who wouldn't take something like that lying down. But I'm intrigued that you kind of did. You kind of went with what he told you. So
the subtext to that is that they actually did me a favor. I had a million ideas. So I was this young person with a million ideas. I wanted to do everything. And weaving channeled all that energy that could have so easily become misdirected. And in some ways, that person was possibly right. I don't think at 18 I was making paintings that were that interesting. So in a funny way, they did me a favor. So the good news is that by channeling that energy into textiles, and also by learning a craft and by learning a skill, you'll like this story. You know, Roger Dean, the artist Roger Dean, who did all the Yes album covers, he was a great friend of my dad's. And I remember him telling me when I was like 17, you know, he gave me a bit of advice. He said, learn a skill. It almost doesn't matter what the skill is. It could be bookbinding. It could be whatever. But learn a skill. And I always remember that really clearly. So in fact, when I was sort of bluntly told that I wasn't a great painter, I kind of thought, okay, fine. If I do textiles, it's really practical. You know, I'll get a job. If everything else fails, I can go into industry. So that kind of pragmatism really appealed to me. And in a way, it was an absolute blessing. I mean, it was just the best thing that could have ever have happened. You know, weaving is so specific and so restrictive. You know, it's about what you can't do, not about what you can do. So it just took all this sort of slightly off the wall energy that I had and it just channeled it really clearly.
Because that restriction is important to you in that case. You needed it at that point.
I think it is. At that point, it was fantastic for me. And also it sort of took everything down to a really basic set of principles. When you use the kind of loom that I use, you can only do straight lines. So it was like, okay, so from now on, I'm going to make art. And of course, the irony is that I still made paintings in inverted commas. The woven works that I made, you know, in 1995, 6, 7, while I was at the Royal College, you know, they look like paintings. They absolutely look like paintings. So in a way, I always was painting. But just putting the colour on the fibre before the cloth was woven instead of afterwards.
Well, this is interesting because this is something I need to get into with, which is how you make your pieces. You've talked about your loom and you use what's called a Dobby loom.
Yeah, that's correct.
I mean, I'm wondering if you could describe that for listeners who maybe aren't familiar and what its attributes might be.
So as I started to say, you can only really do straight lines with a Dobby loom. A jacquard loom is more flexible. It's more pictorial. You can do, your options are much, much greater. With a Dobby loom, it's, without going into too much detail, you have the warp threads, which are the vertical threads. You have the weft threads, which are the horizontal. And you set the loom up. You have a certain limited number of shafts, which enable you to do a specific set of patterns and ideas. So what's interesting about weaving is, in a way, the technology hasn't changed for 1,000 years. It's pretty simple. You've got your warp and your weft, and it's about how they interact. And depending on how many shafts you've got on the loom and what the weave structure is and what the fiber is, that's how you kind of create your pictorial kind of language. But essentially, it's quite restrictive and it's slow. It's incredibly slow. It's very laborious. It's fixed. And I think what people don't realize is when you're weaving 10 meters of cloth, the setup time is anything from 10 days to 3 weeks, depending on what you're doing. And once the loom is set up, it's fixed. The color is fixed on the thread. The length is fixed. The setup is fixed. You can't change it halfway through, or it's very difficult to change it halfway through. And then as you're weaving your 10 meters of cloth, you're winding that cloth around the beam at the front. So you can't see it. So if you're weaving something for 3 months, you can't view it.
So it's not till you finish, till you cut it away from the loom, that you know exactly what you've done.
Exactly.
Which is quite scary.
Very scary. So to make art, to choose to make art, non-functional work through that method is in some ways quite mad and quite crazy. And also because it takes so long, you have to use every inch of cloth that you're weaving. You can't throw any of it away, really. You have to really be very efficient about your time because it's so time consuming. So I think what people don't realize when they're looking at a woven artwork, there's not a lot of leeway with that creative process, which I really enjoyed. You know, I found that really stimulating. You know, I'm a huge fan of abstract expressionism and, you know, Donald Judd, James Turrell, all those sort of minimalist painters. So for me, that geometry was really exciting. Architecture, you know, and then it pulled in all that kind of interest I had in the Bauhaus as well. And color theory. So St. Martin's was unusual in that we did 1 day a week of color theory all through the first year. And it was the only art college to do that. Very, very, very specific. So we did all these Bauhaus, Johannes Itten, Joseph Albers.
Yeah.
Exactly. We did this color course, that was basically invented at the Bauhaus. And we did that color course. And it became absolutely crucial to everything I did after that.
And that's where your profound interest in colour started.
Definitely. I mean, I think I had an instinct for it from day one. But I think that having that training, the theoretical training, really was a huge advantage. And at the time, I didn't really realize, I just thought, well, this is fun. This is interesting. We used to do things like paint 100 squares between blue and orange. And also the other thing at St. Martin's was that the yarn store had no colored yarn in it. It just had white thread. So if you wanted to use color, you had to dye it. You had to go into the dye lab and dye up the color that you wanted. Right. I think now students, they go into a yarn store and there's a million colors that they can just pick off the shelf, but we didn't have that. So I think all of those factors, it was like this incredible sort of sweet spot where they all came together and it was just right for me. And I hit on this way of working, this dip dyeing, the warp threads, and it was painting for me. And I just ran with it and I never stopped.
That's really interesting because it seems to me that your pieces aren't necessarily about the weaving.
That's absolutely right. You're absolutely right about that.
In her essay in your book, Anne Coxon, who's curator of international art at Tate Modern, points out that Annie Albers believed that colour, and I'm going to quote, comes only third in importance among the elements of composition within the weaver's dimensions. And I'm pretty certain you don't agree with that assertion.
I absolutely don't. I always sort of joke that Joseph and Annie Albers, they never had children, but it's almost like I feel like the love child of Joseph and Annie Albers sometimes because, my aesthetic is very Albers, it's very geometric and linear, but I'm a weaver. So obviously I affiliate myself with Annie, but I'm not into texture. And I think some weavers struggle with my work. Most people get excited about weaving because of texture, because of fiber or drape of cloth.
Yeah.
And I stretch everything. And when I was at the Royal College, my tutors hated that. They absolutely hated it. They said it was a terrible idea to stretch the work. But of course, when you're weaving cloth, it's under tension. And I loved that straight line. So I wanted to keep that straight line.
They said it was a terrible idea, but you still did it.
I still did it, absolutely.
By this stage, you were definitely standing your ground. This is
absolutely.
What I'm going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it was the right thing, absolutely the right thing. And I didn't know anyone else doing it. I mean, no one was doing that at that time. And I didn't want to put it behind glass. And I think if you make an artwork, and I knew I wanted to make art, by the way, so that was really clear from day one. I did do some product design later on, which we can talk about. But
we will talk about.
But generally, the art thing always came first, always for me. But you're absolutely right. What's unusual about my work is it's plain weave. So from a technical perspective, it is the most simple, basic weave structure that exists. You could argue, if you looked at a description on paper of my work, plain weave, very, very basic, it shouldn't really work. It should be sort of not very interesting. And I think that sets me apart from a lot of other weavers. And you're absolutely right. In a funny way, the thread is important. What's more important in a way is the dyeing of that thread rather than the kind of weaving. I mean, the weaving is important, but I always wanted this perfect surface, this incredibly beautiful, refined surface. And I think what shocks most people about my work is that it doesn't look hand-woven. So also when you're coming from that background of craftsmanship, you know what it's like in the craft world. It's like people really want evidence of the handmade. They want to see that it's handmade. And I think for years my work really confused people, some people, because they wanted more evidence of the handmade.
Do you feel rebellious? Do you feel like you're rubbing up against convention?
I do, actually. I mean, I think I'm unusual in that I'm a pleaser. I do like to please people. And yet I do also find that I am actually quite strong in my views. And I think when it comes to the work, I'm very committed to this aesthetic. And I've spent 30 years now refining that aesthetic. So I've really nailed it. I'm very clear, about the parameters. And for me, the surface of a cloth is such a beautiful thing. And the ikat weaving, I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about.
Well, we can. I think that would be a good idea. Talk to me about the ikat weaving and how that works, the process.
What I realized quite early on is that if you start with a white cone of yarn, it's like a blank canvas. And I realized that if you go into the dye lab and you dip dye the warp threads, so those are the vertical threads in a piece of cloth, and you dip dye this 10-meter length of thread, you can dip dye it through 100 colors if you want to, or 3 colors. And when you put those threads on the loom, they separate and tension, and it creates this blurred effect. Now, ECAT or ICAT has been around for thousands of years. It's an amazing, amazing technique. And I can't ever claim proprietorial ownership of that technique. It's been around a long, long time. What I think's really special about it is that, I'm just looking at one above me here, is that it just creates this incredible surface and movement. There's so much movement in my work. I mean, it's quite an odd thing. It's static in some ways in that it's this flat cloth, and yet it's full of movement and energy. I mean, I think they're full of energy. And for me, ECAT as a technique, and it was about the dyeing. It's about this quick moment of putting the color on the thread, and that energy somehow, and that movement gets captured in the striation of those threads. I mean, traditional ECAT, or the word ECAT means to bind. And that's actually an Indonesian word. And it's actually, originally the warp threads would have been bound with thread and then dip dyed.
Yes.
And then the thread would have been cut
to
away.
Stop that bit dyeing.
Exactly, like a kind of resist dye technique. So what's interesting is it's kind of this weirdly old-fashioned process. But what's different about the way I do it is I do it in a much looser, much freer, much more intuitive way. Anyone who's ever seen me in the dye lab, I mean, it's quite a bizarre process. I've got like 10, 15 meters of thread, and I'm dipping it into boiling vats of water, and you have to work really fast. You have to move. It's actually quite physical. You've got to move quickly. And I'm sort of fearless when I'm in that headspace. I'm just absolutely in the moment. It's almost like a kind of meditation. I wing it.
Well, yes, that's what I was going to ask, whether you have a plan when you go into the dye lab, but you don't.
Well, it depends. If I'm doing a commission, I have to plan it and I have to follow the sketch, which I enjoy and which I can do very, very efficiently. The older I've gotten, the more I've been able to sort of do work for myself more. And when I'm going into the dye lab for myself, it's a really magical thing. I did a whole series of work that I sort of called unconscious color. And I think there's something very interesting about when the unconsciousness of color kind of come to the surface. Some really exciting things happen. We tend to see color as something that we can control, that there's right and wrong, that this color can only go with that color, and et cetera, et cetera. And I actually really think color gets interesting when it's accidental and when it's intuitive and when it's from the unconscious. So often I go into the dye lab and I really work in this very immediate, unplanned way, which weavers find utterly horrifying. Because, in fact, I was just in the dye lab in Copenhagen the other day on my residency, and there was this woman, and she said, "Oh, you're not measuring anything." You're not measuring anything. What are you doing? She just thought I was insane. She couldn't imagine how I could be in the dye lab and not be measuring every single kind of element. And of course, that's the joy of making art, is that you can just, you can take ownership of how you move through it. I think what's unusual about my work and the way I work is that I have these two sides of my personality. One part of me is incredibly meticulous and controlled and perfectionistic, like insanely so. And then there's another side, which is kind of strangely flamboyant and loose and kind of messy and spontaneous. I think I'm a very, very atypical weaver in that respect, that I have this kind of messy, chaotic side in a way to my methodology. And I think that is very unusual. And I think it makes me unusual as a weaver.
I hope you're enjoying the show. This is just to let you know that the Material Matters Fair returns to Barge House, Oxo Tower Wharf this September from the 18th to 21st. We've signed up an array of fascinating exhibitors already, including Biotex Future, a project on future fibres led by Adidas and RWTH Aachen University. Hydro will be there with its Circal 100R aluminium pieces made entirely from recycled post-consumer scrap. And AHEC will be showing its latest experiments with American maple. We're also working with leading architect T.P. Bennett and the furniture practice on a special project that looks at the material stories of our leading furniture manufacturers. But there are still some spaces remaining. Keen to exhibit? Do drop me a line at hello@materialmatters.design. That's hello@materialmatters.design. Also, if your brand is looking to reach the design world, there are a plethora of sponsorship opportunities. My partner, William Knight, and I would be delighted to hear from you. Architecture has been another, well, I'm going to use the word thread, that runs through your practice. You've worked on projects as a colour consultant, including a number of hospitals. I mean, we're going to talk in general terms here, but do architects not understand colour in your experience? You're presumably filling a gap that some practices feel they have.
Oh gosh, this is controversial territory.
Well, it is.
There are architects around who are brilliant with colour. You know, Sauerbruch Hutton, for example, are just the most phenomenal architectural practice. And also that use a lot of colour. And times have changed. You know, when I did my first hospital project in 2003, I mean, the idea of putting any colour on the hospital, especially on the outside of the building, was just very controversial. But times have changed, and I think our approach to colour and our attitude to colour has changed. I mean, some architects are into colour and some aren't. I mean, most architects, in my experience, generally want the material to bring the colour to a project, and they resist what I would call applied colour. It really depends on the project. I mean, I don't think colour suits every building, and I don't think every situation necessarily needs colour, but when it's used in the right way on the right project, it can be really phenomenal and exciting.
And did you stumble into these projects? I mean, how did that happen?
Yeah, I think I've been quite lucky. So parallel to all my other work that I've done, I've always done colour consulting, and it's always been with architects. And I think it started really early on. You know, in 2000, I think I did the first project. And a lot of it was word of mouth. It's not really a service that you can promote that easily, especially at that time. So often it's been reoccurring architectural practices that have used me. You know, I did a church a couple of years ago in Battersea, which was very beautiful.
It's interesting. What colour did you put in that? You don't really think about churches being, well, ecclesiastical purple, I suppose, but you don't really think of them as being colourful places.
It was a beautiful project. I mean, it took 15 years to happen. So that's the other thing. Is these projects tend to have an incredibly long lifespan. It's St. Peter's Church in Battersea, and it's 500 square metres of digitally printed glass that I designed for them. So it's visible from the outside and from the inside.
Yes,
and
glass makes sense.
Yeah, and it's very sort of elegant. It sort of references, you know, stained glass, of course, but in a much more modern kind of elegant kind of way. So that was a fabulous project and very, very multicoloured. And I'm very interested in colour and wayfinding, and I like to orientate a building using colour. So that project, like many of my projects, you know, putting warm colours on the southern facade, cool colours on the northern facade, etc. So I'm very interested in intelligent use of colour, not random splashing colour around, but actually really thinking about nature and about light, and the sort of more ephemeral elements of colour, I think, are really important.
And along the way, you've also produced cushions for John Lewis, rugs for Christopher Farr, as well as working with the fashion designer Eloise Gray. I mean, this kind of work doesn't make it into the book, interestingly, which feels like a very particular slice of your work. I'm interested, have you turned your back on working at volume? It's
a good question. I love designing, and I had a bit of a shock, you know, around sort of 2011, you know, 2010, 2011, the economy wasn't great. You know, there was the financial crash. And, you know, up until that point, I'd been making really wonderful site-specific architectural installations for a lot of corporate companies. And that stopped overnight, literally overnight. And I found myself in a position where work was really tough. And I got approached by John Lewis, and I said yes. I did the thing that I sort of had resisted for years. I always sort of said, oh, I'll never do anything like a cushion for John Lewis. The good news is I really enjoyed it. And I scanned in hand-dyed, hand-woven artworks and digitally printed them. So everything always came from the handmade. And I did cushions and throws and bed linen. And, you know, I really went for it. I got myself a licensing agent. I did rugs. I did wallpapers. I did lampshades. And I really went for it. And I definitely got something out of my system. And I loved product design. But none of my work was ever really mainstream enough. And everyone almost always said, we love it, but can you tone the color down?
Right.
Because, people, I've done projects for Maid, I've done projects for Heels, John Lewis, all of them. I mean, and this is 10 years ago now. So yeah, at that time in particular, they kind of wanted the craftsmanship and the color, but it didn't sell enough. Products are about volume in my experience. And you either go very high or you go low. You either, you do a very expensive high-end thing and you make very little of it, or you make a lot of something that's at the lower end. Very, very difficult to do anything in the middle, in my experience. But I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I loved working on the computer, which was a real surprise. I loved digital printing, and I really enjoyed product design. And then it was really interesting. I just came to a very natural end with that process. Apart from the rugs, which I still do. I still have a rug business where I design rugs that are made in India. They're hand-dyed, they're hand-woven, but not by me. Made in India, and that feels like a very comfortable product for me to work with. But I keep it very separate from the artwork.
So for years, you didn't paint. I mean, presumably after your tutor at Foundation told you you were rubbish at painting, you didn't paint. As critic and author Chloe Ashby writes in your book, it was mid-September in 2018, a couple of months before your 45th birthday, and you woke up and decided you were going to produce 100 paintings in a day. So what happened?
It was amazing. I'll never forget that day. It was something that had been on my mind for years and years and years. So I'd done a little bit of life drawing in that intervening 25-year period. But that's it. And I'd certainly never painted an abstract painting. And I guess I knew in the back of my head, one day I was going to do it. It was just a case of actually getting on with it. And that day, for all kinds of reasons, I just thought this is the moment. So I didn't quite make it to 100. I did about 66 paintings, and they were very small, and they were really, I just did them. And I think what was interesting is not judging them, just letting them come, letting them be what they are. It sounds a little bit kind of pretentious, but for me that day, it unleashed something. And initially I didn't show anyone what I was doing. I didn't care. I didn't think I was never going to sell them. I was never going to show them to anyone. It was something I wanted to do for myself, to sort of get something out of my system. And then, of course, lockdown happened. So probably 2 years later, we're in lockdown, or a year and a half later. And of course, it was this weird moment where I just painted and painted and painted and painted. And it was like this rocket went off. It was very, very, very exciting and very unexpected at that moment in my life.
Interesting.
And they were very small initially, which is uncharacteristic for me. They were small paintings. And I was obsessed. I mean, absolutely, totally obsessed and compulsive, I would say. I mean, I'm pretty compulsive about the weaving, but then I just got super compulsive about painting. And it was so immediate. So it was almost like this revelation, and I could go outside. I could, in lockdown, I could go walk, into a field and sit down and make 25 little paintings. And I suddenly realized how sort of bonded to my loom I had been, in a good way over all those years. And it was suddenly like very surprising and magical. And I feel so lucky. And then the weird thing is that I showed them to a few friends, and people actually really, really liked them. And I was so surprised. I pride myself on my meticulous skill as a weaver. So to make art when no one has taught me how to do it correctly feels quite uncomfortable and quite strange. I think when you come from a very craft-heavy sort of background, the looseness of the painting is a bit, initially I was quite uncomfortable with that.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, one of the things I'm quite keen to ask, it's a little bit sensitive, but I mean, in her essay, Ashby puts this kind of newfound energy that you've described and desire to paint in part down to the realization that you weren't going to have a child. I mean, it's your book, so I'm guessing you agree with that analysis?
Absolutely. And and I'm happy to talk about that. It was definitely connected. I think when you reach a certain age and you realize that you're not going to have a child for all kinds of reasons, you start to think about your legacy. What are you leaving behind? What's the point? Why are you here? Why are we doing what we do? But more interestingly, and I haven't really talked to that many women about this, but I realized that I had been holding energy back for motherhood.
Okay, that's interesting.
I didn't know I was, but it turns out that I had been storing up some energy. Everyone I spoke to said, oh God, having a child's so exhausting and tiring, and that you've got to have a lot of energy. And of course, I'd always thought, well, I'll just hold that energy back for when I have a child. And then at 45, it was just apparent that was really, really not going to happen once and for all. And it was like this release of energy that I had been holding back. And it was so unexpected and so surprising. I didn't realize I had been doing it. And then when I started painting, I think it was to do with the immediacy. So weaving is cerebral. It comes from the brain. It's all to do with the mind and the brain, and it's very thought-based. And for me, personally, painting comes from the gut. It comes from the heart. It's much more emotional. And I think it was just this sort of surprising release of sort of energy.
Well, there is a sense of abandon about these paintings.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They're quick, they're gestural, they're spontaneous. In a way, they're everything the weaving isn't. What's really bizarre is how interesting they look next to each other. Because you would think, on one hand, you've got these linear, controlled woven pieces, and then you've got these gestural, momentary, quick paintings, and they shouldn't really connect. But what's really mysterious is how they speak the same language, and that language is colour.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing, obviously, is weaving is dry, and your painting, well, is not. It's very
absolutely.
wet.
I mean, it's like it couldn't be more opposite. You're absolutely right. Everything about the painting is wet and messy and visceral somehow. And then, of course, the other thing I've been thinking about in the back of my mind was I'd always wanted to paint on top of the weaving. So I'd always wanted to take that canvas, that hand-dyed, hand-woven canvas that I'd meticulously made. And then I'd always wanted to just try what would it be like to actually paint on it. And there's something really subversive about that.
Well, I mean, it is an extraordinarily brave thing to do. There's a lovely interview piece between you and the renowned artist and designer and a longtime friend, Ez Devlin, who says, and I think jokingly, that you, and here again I'm going to quote, fucking deface these things by painting on them. I mean, did you fucking deface them? You obviously don't feel that way, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Deface, yes. And Anne Coxon sums it up really well. She uses this phrase, a loaded wet paintbrush. I love that idea. Like this loaded wet brush hovering over the surface of the woven textile. And it is an act of anarchy almost. Maybe I'm more rebellious than I think I am. And I think the craziness of doing that.
I mean, it could be construed as a moment of anger, but it wasn't anger. It was something else.
No, it was much more positive energy than that. But it is defacing the work in some ways. And I think when certain weavers look at these, what I call thread paintings, they're horrified, like, what the fuck are you doing? You're like, and when they know how long it takes to make something, it's like, are you insane? Why are you doing that?
Can you remember the moment when you did decide to do that? When you did pick up the paintbrush and apply it, and how you felt at that moment in time?
I just thought, I've got nothing to lose. I'm just going to do it. And I think I probably had a Negroni or something, or a vodka or something beforehand. One of the first ones that I did was on a pair of artworks. In fact, one of them's on the cover of the book. So it was a piece I wove in 2017. So it was a piece that I had already had as an artwork. And then I just painted on it. And I had no idea if it was going to work. Yeah, I just went for it, basically. And they don't all work. I mean, I think that's this thing about getting a bit older, is that you realize that sort of failure is kind of fabulous. And to allow that, the work gets so much more interesting when you allow that to really happen. And yeah, you might blow it, but you know what? It's so interesting. And if you can sort of have faith, and just keep going. And I just found that really, really exciting. I mean, in a way, the last 5 years have just been phenomenal in that regard.
Did you worry about putting the paintings out there initially? Because it's a new medium for you. And
yes.
As you say, it's not one you were trained in.
Yes,
you did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm still terrified about it. I try not to judge them. I just try and put them out there and let other people judge them. Painting, and Anne touches on this, and she and I have talked about it. The canon of painting is such a big, loaded, heavy thing. Being a painter I mean, it's we could do a whole conversation just about that. So it's scary. There's a lot of weight there. There's a lot of expectation. There's a lot of judgment. And I think I find it quite hard, especially after sort of having become so skilled at my woven works, and also this, when you come from a craft background, as you can really appreciate, everything I've ever done has been slow and meticulously crafted. So if I make a painting in an hour, it's a very shocking experience. I've only ever made art that takes months to make. I can't make a piece of my woven work in less than 6 weeks. So to be able to make a painting in a day or in an afternoon is quite terrifying. And of course, how do you value that? Is it less or more valuable because it took me an afternoon instead of taking me 6 months or 3 months or 2 months?
Well, I guess the market in your gallery decides that, right?
Well, in a way, I mean, and then of course, by painting on the weaving, you're creating this conundrum really, because it's they're very difficult to price, these pieces, because the risk factor is so enormous. And also, as far as I'm aware, I don't know anyone else doing it. I know a lot of weavers and I know a lot of painters. I know weavers that paint on the warp, maybe, or intervene in other ways. I don't know any weavers that literally use the woven cloth as a painting backdrop.
I mean, you've said that you're asking the viewer quite a complicated question about what a painting is.
Absolutely.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, so 2 things happened. When I started painting, initially it was on paper, almost exclusively. And I was obsessed with this Arches watercolor paper. It's a very old French watercolor paper maker. Oh my God, I'd make it really wet and I'd drop the dye and drop the color onto the paper. And then I thought, hold on a second, what's this made out of? And of course I looked, it's 100% cotton paper.
Right.
So of course it is a textile. So then I suddenly thought, hold on, these paintings are textiles. I'm making them incredibly wet. They're made out of 100% cotton. They then become fluid and then I'm dyeing them. So how is this any different to the cotton thread paintings? And then the other thing is, most painters, 90% of painting is made on canvas that happens to be machine woven, right? But it's cloth. So you could argue that all paintings painted on cloth are textiles because they're on cloth. So why do we have this problem? Why do we have this uncomfortableness and this tension between textile and painting, when really, and I think Anne makes the point really clearly, actually they're deeply entwined and they're deeply linked. And what is a painting? Most of the time, a painting is a textile. What I think is crucial is it's the moment of intervention of the pigment. You can put the pigment on before the cloth is woven, which is what I'm doing with my ECAP pieces. You can put the pigment on the cloth, on the fiber during the weaving process. So you can paint on the warp threads on the loom, or you can finish the woven cloth and then apply the pigment. So in a way, all of those are paintings.
So it's a question of timing. This is what we're saying.
It's timing, and it's the moment of intervention. And I think that's just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. Can we get into your background? Were you always going to be an artist? You describe in the book your upbringing as being bohemian. I'm kind of keen to know how bohemian it might have been.
Pretty bohemian. Look at my name. So Ptolemy is an ancient Greek, ancient Egyptian name, and it's a man's name. And when I was born, my father, he was reading a book about Ptolemy, who was, that was the 16th century Ptolemy, who was a philosopher. And he just thought it was a great name. And of course, my surname is Mann. So I don't think it ever occurred to him that giving his daughter a double masculine name was in any way unusual or problematic. So he just went for it. And so I think in a funny way, just having the name, it's like almost before I was even conscious of what my name even was, it's like something that you wear. It's like an ownership. So, and I've always loved my name. I mean, I think it's kind of extraordinary, and I feel kind of lucky and honored to be given this extraordinary name. But it does sort of set a landscape, I suppose. And my father is an astrologer, and he trained as an architect, and he's a painter, and he's written 20 books about astrology and tarot and sacred architecture and landscapes. And anyway, so he's an extraordinary character. And I grew up, watching him paint.
He raised you, right? Because you were born in New York and then your parents split and he took you back to the UK when you were, 6 months old or something?
Yeah, that's correct. So essentially, and I've had, other stepmother figures in my life. Yeah, it's complicated. And then I met my real mum, my biological mother, when I was 17. And she was living in New York making documentary films and really had the most extraordinary milieu of friends and connections. She had a film distribution company, and they were the first people to show Derek Jarman's films, in the 80s. Yeah. And she was extraordinary in her own way. So I had a very, very bohemian upbringing.
And were you always drawing as a child?
Always obsessive. Yeah. And it's funny now when I look back, I think I've always been quite obsessive. I don't think I ever realized quite how obsessive I was or am. But always drawing, always. And of course, back then, as you probably remember, I don't ever remember watching television ever.
I watched loads of telly.
I didn't. Did you? I didn't watch any television.
Hours
I was always drawing.
I was addicted to Crossroads. I used to watch 2 different versions of Crossroads on the same night.
Okay.
My parents were very worried about me.
Okay. So that's interesting because I don't really remember watching TV, and I was always drawing or out running around in the woods. So I think it was kind of inevitable. I also felt like I hated school. I had a terrible time at school until I was about 16. Yeah. And I wasn't good at exams. I felt like I wasn't very intelligent, and I just didn't function very well in that world. And it was a bit of a revelation, when I hit sort of 16, 17, and I realized that actually I just was really bad at exams. I wasn't necessarily totally stupid. And then going to art school definitely. And I was lucky, I think. I was at St. Martin's in the Royal College at a really, really exciting time. Alexander McQueen had just graduated from St. Martin's. Stella McCartney was in my year. It was a really, really interesting moment to be in London and to be at those fabulous art schools.
Can I just ask, did you maintain a relationship with your mother when you met her when you were 17?
Yes, absolutely. She sadly died in 2012. So for 20 years, we had a really great time. And we really sort of were able to rebuild our relationship in a kind of fabulous way.
Yeah, really interesting. And was it your choice to see her at 17?
Pretty much.
How did that happen?
She initiated it.
Right.
She said, come and see me in New York, but come on your own without your dad.
Okay.
So I did. And for many years, I went to New York, twice a year, and I spent a lot of time there.
And what did they make of you taking up textiles?
My parents, they were phenomenal about that. They just thought it was great. They thought it was so interesting and so unexpected. And I remember, when I first started weaving, everyone just thought I was mad. They were like, you can't hand weave artworks. Are you insane? Like, it's just not viable. People were quite negative in some ways, but my parents were great. Neither of them had ever really followed any conventional path.
But you were writing film scripts at St. Martin's as well, weren't you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think they didn't know what to do with me. I wrote a film script using weaving as a metaphor for a group of characters and how
let's talk about that. How did that work?
Well, I think what's interesting is for me, weaving is it's a methodology, right? So it's about process and methodology. And I think that's what's really interesting about craft in general, but weaving specifically. And it teaches you a way of thinking and a way of processing ideas. And it occurred to me, when I was 19 or however old, 20, when I wrote that film script, that the act of weaving involved these different strands and also the etymology of weaving, time warp. In fact, the script was called Warped. And it was a play on words. It was like the warp of a cloth, but it was also something that's distorted and fallen apart and something that's lost its sort of structure. And I started reading about mythology, you know, about Athena and about how weaving wasn't just about weaving cloth. It was about weaving stories and narratives and myths. And then architecture, you know, the structure of buildings echoed the structure of cloth. And I just suddenly, my mind was blown. I just suddenly felt that weaving was actually this enormous metaphor for life. And then the whole link with technology, you know, I started reading, you know, when I was in my late teens, I started reading things like The Difference Engine by William Gibson. It's a book set in Victorian London, and it's about if Charles Babbage's difference engine had actually been built in the 1850s, we actually would have had a computer in 1850, not in 1950. And it's a wonderful novel. I mean, it's pretty schmaltzy, but it's great. It's about running around Victorian London and there's this computation machine. And of course, it's based on a jacquard loom. And of course, now everybody's talking about Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage and the difference engine and all of that. But when I read about him in 1992, everyone just thought it was kind of so off the wall and obscure. And it just made me think, actually, weaving is incredible. It's obscure, but actually it taps into our recent past, but also our ancient history. And I just found that absolutely fascinating. And I still do. I mean, I think it's a really powerful thing.
The aesthetic that you've developed over 30 years with the weaving, you know, the textiles stretched on a frame. When did that emerge? Did that emerge at the Royal College of Art, or were you already doing that at Central St Martin's?
I mean, it's a good question. When I was at St Martin's, my degree show were these very large, loose-hanging textiles. They were wall-based, but they were loose-hanging. And I found that really problematic. And they were very linear. In fact, they were based on film. They had black and white selvages, and then they had these sort of windows of color. They were very Bauhaus, but they hung loose. And I think I found that very distressing. I didn't like that idea of a curtain, or even the word wall hanging kind of made me very uncomfortable. It wasn't what I was aiming for. I don't know, it just made so much sense to me to start stretching, especially little small pieces. So I started taking these like 40 by 40 centimeters squares, stretching them over a frame, which to me echoed the circumstances that they were made under, so under tension on the loom. And it just made sense. And then you hung it on the wall and it just came into focus. I mean, it was a bit like, to use even another film analogy, it's like everything came into focus the minute I stretched them. And I never looked back. I mean, I could show you an image of my degree show in 1997. And in some ways, the work has changed quite little in that period of time. I think it's gotten better. I think my skills have improved enormously. But funnily enough, the aesthetic was pretty clear from day one. And also, my degree show was, 12-meter high wall. It was absolutely enormous. Everyone else had their little kind of setups. And I said, oh, God, can I use the whole wall? And they were like, sure. So I used this sort of double height atrium space at the Royal College, which no one had ever used before for their degree show. So scale was always really important.
It was always working at an architectural scale, wasn't it? Very early on.
From day one. And it's funny when I think back now, not that it came out sort of fully formed, but I guess it was pretty clear from day one. And it hasn't really wavered that much. I mean, but I have been innovative in my own way. I've made, monolithic pieces. I've made quite sculptural, three-dimensional works. And I am always trying to push the work ahead, but still to maintain a kind of identity, I suppose. I think all artists try and do that.
I'm interested as to where you think textiles is at the moment. And when I was researching you, I looked at a 2015 piece in Crafts, which I used to edit. And you said in that piece that you couldn't think of a single contemporary textile artist who is taken seriously. Now, obviously, since then, we've had the Annie Albers show at Tate Modern in 2018. Unravel is currently at the Barbican, which looks at how fibre art can take on a panoply of social issues. So I'm interested, do you still think that's the case?
No, I think things have changed a lot in a relatively short period of time. And I think the Annie Albers show at the Tate was a game changer. I think to have that show at the Tate Modern was extraordinary. I think if that show had been at the Design Museum, the connotations would have been completely different. So I think actually something really quite wonderful happened with that show. And I think it triggered something quite profound. For anyone who works in textiles, I think you could ask You could ask anyone that question and they would probably say something similar. And I think it's really exciting, and I feel really lucky. I feel like I'm doing the right work at the right time. And I think that's quite rare. I think sometimes people do wonderful work, but it's at the wrong moment. But I sort of feel quite excited. And I'm glad it's happened now than when I was 20. I'm much better placed now to sort of run with it and embrace it. So I think things have changed enormously in, 6 or 7 years. And I feel very encouraged. I think the way we value textile art is changing. And I think there's more overlap between fine art and textile art. And I feel much more comfortable now to sort of say I'm an artist who happens to make art through weaving and painting. I don't feel that I have to define myself as a sort of textile artist anymore.
No, interesting. Ptolemy, our time is up, rather sadly. I've thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you very much. Standard final question. What the future holds? I mean, obviously, there's the book, which is coming out in May. But will textiles lose you to painting ultimately?
Not now, not yet. There's something about weaving that is so extraordinary. And I think this whole merging of the weaving and the painting, I just think it's so interesting. And I'm just at the very beginning of that journey. I've just dipped my toe in. I haven't even begun to really explore what the possibilities are and where the kind of cross-fertilization can come between these two kind of extraordinary processes. And I think I'm in the right place to explore that.
Very good. Well, that's the next book sorted then.
Absolutely. Oh, and by the way, there will be a book, with all the design and architecture, and that will be significant colour. So watch this space.
Very good. Ptolemy Mann, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
To find out more about Ptolemy, go to ptolemymann.com. As ever, to find the other podcasts that I've done and to sign up to our newsletter, go to materialmatters.design. And there are images relating to the interviews on our Instagram page, which is also materialmatters.design. Finally, this is really important too. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to us from. And it would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £2.50 a month, you can receive an invite to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.